Hello, my name is Richard Goyette. The topic of this video is Extra Biblical Truth, Case Study Number 1, The Stories in Genesis. When I was a young man struggling with my faith, I desperately wanted to believe the gospel of Christ and find assurance of my salvation. A huge obstacle for me was the difficulty I had accepting the literal truth of many Old Testament passages of Scripture, especially the creation account in Genesis and the events relating to human origins, the fall of man, the Garden of Eden, the flood story, the story of the Tower of Babel, and so on. I was completely unable to believe that they are literally true. As I read the narratives, they seemed rather absurd in many ways. Although I believe that God is completely able to circumvent and violate the laws of science, I couldn't believe that there would be any logical reason for him to do so in the manner described in Genesis. Why would God choose to accomplish supernaturally what he could just as easily do through the natural processes which he had already set in motion? A bigger question for me was this: why would God create the world in 7 literal 24-hour days and then create a false geological, linguistic, cosmological, and archaeological history that would make it appear that the process occurred over billions of years? Why would God attempt to fool us in this way, and in so doing make it nearly impossible for reputable scientists and rational thinkers to believe the Bible? To make matters even worse, these stories lacked plausibility. Why would God need to rest on the 7th day? Why would God need to scoop up a handful of clay or a rib from the side of Eve to create the first male and female? Why would God, who is supposedly omniscient, be walking around in the garden, calling out to Adam in order to find out where he was hiding? And a talking snake? Give me a break. If God wanted to destroy all mankind and start over, why would there be a need at all for a worldwide flood and the ark? Why not just snuff out all the bad guys instantaneously? This would eliminate the need to put millions of species of animals onto an ark that was not nearly big enough to accommodate them. Do the math. Why would a man-made tower that reaches at most a few hundred feet into the air be such a threat to God? The confusion of languages at Babel seems not only unlikely, but makes no sense at all. A confusion of languages would not at all be necessary in order to encourage mankind to spread out and explore their world. I could go on and on. These ancient stories bear all the bear all the earmarks of legend and myth. They are not contradicted by the findings of science. They are contradicted by the findings of science, especially geology, cosmology, and paleontology. If the stories in Genesis are not historically true and inaccurate, in what sense may they be relied upon for discovering truth about God and for guidance in making important life decisions? According to 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. This passage says nothing about the Hebrew Bible, i.e. the Old Testament, being historically accurate or literally true. In the Bible, we find many different genres of literature, including historical narratives, legends, myths, poetry, songs, sermons and homilies, symbolism, imagery, parables, similes, and proverbs. none of which need to be scientifically or historically accurate in order to convey spiritual and moral truths. The Bible was derived from many oral and written sources, none of which originated with the intent of being incorporated into an infallible, inerrant book, which would be identified by many as the authoritative word or words of God Himself. Their original intent and purpose was to communicate information that would motivate people to conduct their lives in a manner pleasing to God and beneficial to mankind. So, with this in mind, what can we learn from extra-biblical sources that will help us better understand, interpret, and benefit from the stories and legends in the book of Genesis? Well, first of all, we learn from science, geology, linguistics, cosmology, and paleontology that the stories are not literally and historically true. Because of this, I personally would be reluctant to base any critical theological teaching on a literalistic interpretation of these stories. In order to believe Christian doctrines relating to the observance of the Sabbath, capital punishment, the existence of Satan, original sin, human depravity, and so on, I personally would need to find support for those doctrines elsewhere in Scripture. What we learn from archaeology is that these stories are a huge improvement over the creation myths and legends of the surrounding Babylonian and Sumerian cultures, from which they are partially derived. We see evidence of an evolution in thought. God is still described in largely anthropomorphic terms, but is now viewed as the creator of the universe, and He is a righteous God who enforces a moral code that will develop into something quite sophisticated over time. Thank you.